So my name is Jimmy Bogard. You can find me on Twitter at @jbogard. All my presentations and anything I do is on my GitHub, so you can find that at github.com/jbogard. And I blog sometimes, so you can find me there at jimmybogard.com. I've also got links to videos and other presentations on that website as well. I work for a company called Headspring out of Austin, Texas, where I just build custom systems for our customers. And today's talk is actually about a custom, two big systems that I was tech lead on, and some of the lessons that we learned out of that. I had some other junk about me, open source and other stuff like that, whatever. So so like I said before, this is a talk in two parts. I was fortunate enough, I guess, to work in two projects for a client that were almost in the same domain. Separated by about 4 years or so. I can do this. Hey. Is that better? No. It's like hanging down there. Okay. You can like talk down like this the whole time. Would that work too? Okay. So these were two projects separated by about 4 years in nearly identical domain. It wasn't a rewrite though, so we didn't fall trap to that. But it was two projects for similar clients in almost identical domain. The first one was started in about 2007, 2008 or so, and the second one was about 2012. And so we were able to take a lot of the lessons learned from the first project and apply them to the second one. So this talk is really about all the things I did wrong with the first project and how I was able to fix them on the second one. Sound good? Okay, part one, the majestic monolith. Has anyone heard this term before, the majestic monolith? Okay, so around the time that the microservice term started to become more fashionable, the creator of Ruby on Rails, DHH, railed against this idea of microservices and said, you know what, it's actually okay to build this one really big system that does everything. And the microservice people give it kind of a negative term, a monolith, but he said, you know what, those monoliths aren't always so bad. They can be majestic as well. So he had this idea of a majestic monolith. It had nothing to do with the fact that his framework that he made really encourages this kind of architectures whatsoever. But that's his idea that you don't have to build these really small systems. You can put everything into one really big systems and said, you know what, actually you should start out on that. So this first part is us building one single large project. So just a little bit of background on this project. Our customer down here was the Texas Juvenile Justice Department. And the idea is that if a kid got in trouble in the state of Texas, that they would have to, there's a very different legal system that they have to go through, different legal process. And this project that we were building, this product we were building, was intended to help that kid go through the legal process and also make sure that the kid didn't get in more trouble. The whole purpose was to say, let's make sure that he doesn't become a repeat offender and become an adult offender. Let's see what programs and support we can put in place to make sure this kid doesn't get in trouble later on in his life. So in the state of Texas, every single county has their own individual IT budget. And each individual county would build their own kind of system to these things. So the idea behind this one was, no one county can pay for the entire system. So how about all these counties pool their resources together and then build a system for everyone so that everyone can use it. So it was a lot of different counties and a lot of different state agencies also pulling the money together to build this one single system. It was also a lot of firsts for the state of Texas as well. It was the very first agile project for any Texas government agency that we knew about, and we knew a lot of them because we had to deal with the IT departments for all of them. And they're all very, very much a waterfall kind of process. Probably still today because government, they have to do that kind of thing. But they said we're going to do something different. We'll make this an agile project. Now we weren't actually the first company to try to build this for them. The previous company that they were working with spent 12 months. 7 figures, and the only thing they produced was a stack of Word documents about this high, like this high or so, that described all the requirements of the thing they were supposed to build. And so we got there. They didn't produce anything. We threw all the documents out. Went outside, lit a fire, had a big rah-rah moment there, and said, we're going to make this an agile project because we want to deliver quickly. I will have a side note here. our contract was actually written so that we would get paid per sprint. And I would suggest never doing that. That's a very bad idea to get paid per sprint, because how do you know whether you did the work you're supposed to do? Well, you're supposed to agree up front at each sprint. So I would say just never do that. Don't put Agile actually in your contract. It's kind of a terrible idea. It was also the very first DDD project that we knew of for also any Texas government agency. Most of the systems that they had up until this point were very much like those green screen CRUD kind of applications. They'd see a record, they would modify the record, and they would save the record, and that was it. The actual business processes that were going on behind the scenes were in those really big comment fields at the bottom. Do you have one of those too? Like the actual application is in the comments field. That's where the work actually gets done, where someone writes a note, puts a little date on it, little initials as well, and they pass it to someone else. It's like, oh, email someone else. Now they have to do something else. That's where the actual work is being done. So we were going to do things different. We're going to build something that actually follows some of the domain-driven design concepts and ideals. Now, the previous systems, of which there were many, were all built by each individual IT department in the state of Texas. Now, some cities were bigger and, of course, then had more budget to build systems. So the large cities in the state of Texas had their own individual applications. So Dallas had their own system. Fort Worth had their own system. Houston, of course, had their own system. San Antonio, Austin, all the major cities in Texas had built their own individual systems, all of which had different platforms, different backgrounds, different ages, or all completely different, solving these problems very differently. Everyone else in the state of Texas used a system that was provided by that Texas Juvenile Justice Department. And this one was, surprise, surprise, a Microsoft Access application, because of course it was, right? Oh, you're groaning, but it's fine. It's just Access. I mean, some of these... At least it wasn't Excel. I'm sure there was Excel somewhere in there. There's some shared drive somewhere with Excel on it in there. But if you're a small town in West Texas that has like 20 people that live there, I mean, you don't need this really big enterprise level system. So for them, where kids may get in trouble like every other month, and usually it's like the son of the football coach, so actually it's just sweep it under the rug because who cares? They didn't really have that much traffic. So what we were going to try to do was build one system for all of these people. And this system, of course, because we're in the government, we have to have a TLA, right? 3-letter acronym. So this is going to be the Juvenile Case Management System, or JCMS. Or as our product owners would call it, the JCMS system, because they also like redundancy. Now, our main product owners throughout this entire process were the probation officers for the kids. Now, the probation officer is really the person in charge, the caseworker, to try to make sure this kid, when they get in trouble, that they don't get in trouble anymore, and see what programs we can put in place, what kind of restitutions do they need to do, they need to get out of this bad home into a better home, things like that. They were the really ones driving the entire system. And so for them, they had a really personal connection to this system and this project. I mean, I was literally in like Scrum sprint planning meetings where they would bring up some kid and they start to like literally get tears in their eyes because they were thinking of how the system could benefit the kids they were trying to help out. So some of the goals they had as part of this, one of the very first ones was to increase knowledge sharing. In the first, the previous set of systems where every single city and county had their own individual system, none of those systems talked to each other. So no one knew that if a kid got in trouble in one city and they moved, they would know any kind of previous history with what happened with that kid. And of course, there's all sorts of legal ramifications of records with kids and things like that. But just to even know, like, we tried this program and it didn't work. Maybe we should try something else. They had no visibility into that whatsoever. Even something as really bad as things like, oh, he's got in trouble with this family, let's go sit him with his uncle. And actually, the other system shows that there were really bad things happening at the uncle's house. So those are the kind of things that they had zero visibility into. And with this system, when everyone kind of pulls the resources and builds off this one system, then we can actually see what's going on with this kid and try to give that kid the best possible chance they have to live a good life. That was the idea. The other thing they wanted to do was to build a single system that covered all aspects of the juvenile legal process. When I said there were previous systems, I had one box per county, but in reality that box was very subdivided in each of those counties. So each county had like a jail system, a legal court system, prosecution system, like dozens and dozens of systems, and they wanted to replace all of those with one system for absolutely everyone. I think at our last tally, this system was going to replace about 100 individual systems across the state of Texas. And with this one, they wanted to be able to cover all aspects all at once, as opposed to having to build a bunch of little systems. And we'll see how that bit us in the ass a little bit later. The final thing they wanted to have was a complete picture of the kid from start to finish, to understand, make sure that not only that they went in the right process, be able to understand everything that was going on and try to give them the best possible care and the best possible resources to try to make sure they didn't get in trouble anymore. So all very, very lofty goals, very ideal goals. And it was hard to argue against any of these, right? You're like, well, yeah, of course, why wouldn't we want to increase knowledge sharing? That sounds like a good thing. Why wouldn't we want to have a system that covers all aspects so it's not just a bunch of piecemeal things? And why wouldn't we want to have that very complete picture of the juvenile so that we understood from start to finish how everything was going? This is the legal process in the state of Texas. It's complicated, obviously, because law is complicated. And the part that we were going to be tasked with, this is actually for adults and kids. So you can see that there's this like kind of top sort of processes there. That's for all the adults. But it branches off whenever they figure out that the person that got in trouble is a juvenile, then it goes into a separate process. So we were actually only tasked with building the very bottom part. And this picture here was plotted out and printed in color on a giant wall so we could all like stare, sitting around and be like, yep, it's right there. There we are. There we are in the process here. So, Agile project. What's the first thing you need to do with a new Agile project? How do you start developing? What do you start developing on or with? User stories, right? We need user stories. Everyone loves those, right? As a blank, I want to blank so that blank. I want to get a knife so that I can stab myself so that I don't have to do these stupid user stories ever again. Quick question, yes? So the question was, how big was our team at the time? At some point, if I looked at everyone in the room, it was about 50. This included the product owners for each individual county. This included all the developers, all the QA. Everyone involved was probably about 50. Our development team started with around 12 people, and by the end of the project, we were, or probably 6 to 9 months in, we were about 4 to 6 people. Just based on realizing that you can only develop so fast, and if they can't build the user stories, you don't need all those developers. So the product owners were also in the same room, and we did the whole XP thing, like whole team together. So like literally everyone commuted to this one central office in the state of Texas every week. And so they had the product owners would drive in on Monday and leave on Friday, like really big personal sacrifice to build the system. So yes, the very first thing we need when we're doing an Agile project is we need user stories. And to have that user story, the as a blank, you need to come up with individual personas. So that's the very first thing we did, is figure out what are all the personas and people actually using the system. And of course, we wanted to have clever names because we had to remember who these people were. So we had like Matt, the mental health practitioner. We had Pete, the probation officer. Pete's kind of surly, so you want to give him his copy before he gets going in the morning. We had Larry, the law enforcement officer. Nancy, the nurse. Judy, the judge. Of course, right? And so we did this for all the different personas in the system. We kept adding and adding and adding all the different kinds of people we could possibly find, even getting Patty, probation officer with disposition privileges, because why not? and filled out all the different kinds of people that could work across that entire thing. Now this was our first go at it, but as we started talking more and more to the product owners, like, oh, actually, there's the law enforcement officer, but there's also the law enforcement supervisor, and they have different privileges than the other person. They have different needs out of this project. And so we kept going and kept going to the point we had something like 72 personas that we built out from our conversations. These were all on these really giant Post-it notes because, again, you're supposed to have like card and conversation, all that junk from Agile, right? Again, this is like we're doing everything by the literal book. I had a signed copy of the Scrum book from Ken Schwaber. I was like, the Bible of how we're going to do Scrum right there. So all these personas we put on the board, but we looked at them like this. It was just impossible to figure out who was what and what was going on here. So we started to color code them based on individual agencies. And so this is our very first lesson, that had we had a chance to do it over, we may take a step back and say, you know what, it seems like that these different color coding based on agency, they have very different rules and regulations and laws covering those different pieces. is it a good idea that we try to put every one of these people into one single system? Well, it was literally in the contract to do so, so I didn't have any really say in the matter. But taking a step back, like why, when these people have very different needs, a truancy officer has nothing to do with the nurse, so why do these two people need to use the exact same system? So that was our first lesson. Bounded contexts are a thing, and we should perhaps think about looking at them. All right, here I'm showing the menu options for looking at an individual juvenile. And each of those menu items is a separate agency in the state of Texas that would have to deal with that. So for any one individual user, this menu might just show one or two things, but we were trying to build a system that could cover all these different aspects, from dispositions to detention, which, by the way, you don't call it jail for kids, it's detention, because you got to use a little bit softer language, it turns out, to FOP and FIR. I have no idea what those are, but that's what we had to build. And so we're trying to build something that covers every single aspect of the juvenile system, the juvenile process, and we completely missed this whole part about bounded contexts. Now, bounded contexts are that part of the book in the DDD book that no one ever gets to. Right? By the time you get to that part of the book, you're just like, oh my god, I get it. Okay, entities, root, aggregates, fine. Let's just start coding. And so no one really ever gets to that last part of the book that talks about what do you do when you have one model that can't satisfy every single person that's going to be using the system? How do you break these things up? We didn't get that part, and so we just built one system for absolutely everyone. And this started to show its problems when we started to try to do some modeling. So in the very early days of the project, we tried to figure out like what is the most important object, most important record, most important entity that everyone would be dealing with. But the problem was we couldn't get everyone to agree about what that single thing was. To the point where we said like, well, we have juveniles, we have adults, but those are both people, right? And we don't want to have any data duplication, so we wound up doing things like creating a person table. Does anyone have a person table in their system that's like everything for everyone, but it's nothing for anyone because it's trying to be everything? So we had one of those, a person table that had every single possible attribute that could ever happen with any individual that used the system. And every human that touched this system had a record in this person table. So just like the law enforcement officer, they're a person, right? Can't disagree with that. Well, yeah, okay, they're a person. And so they had to have a record in the system. Any person that logged into the system had to be a record in the system. So juvenile, right, that's a person. So a juvenile has this record here as well. Now this led to some very interesting side effects. In fact, it led to some side effects that seemed like it was the complete opposite of what the system was designed for. So what I mean by that, let's say you're a kid that gets in trouble. You get in trouble, you have a really good probation officer, a really good caseworker that tries to get on the straight and narrow path, and they get you in a better school, that you can get better grades, and so you actually graduate from high school, and hey, you can actually go to college now. So they go to college, and they as they go through school, they think about what they want to do in life. But you know what, they remember actually their caseworker and said, you know what, I really liked how they were able to help people out, so I want to help people out too. I'm going to become a lawyer to help out these kids that get in trouble. So they become a lawyer in the state of Texas to help these kids out. And the first time they go to log in the system throws an exception saying, you're already a user in the system. Like, that's odd. And you can't change your role because kids can't be lawyers, right? That's crazy. There's like all these, so it actually prevented them from the entire reason for the system to exist by having this one ambiguous table with, of course, like 200 columns, right? Because like, it has to be everything for everyone, so it's the widest possible table imaginable. So that was our second lesson, that our ubiquitous language, the thing that everyone talks about on a daily basis, the terms they use, should actually be ubiquitous. Like it actually should follow the definition of the word. When we went to all the people talking about this system, no one ever used the term person. That was not like a legal definition, that was not a domain definition, but it was the least common denominator for all these different things we were trying to shove into this one table. So just to try to compromise and try to have something that actually fit, we used a modeling definition that no one ever actually used in real life. And that can become a real problem when you're trying to reason about this thing and no one even knows what that term means. Like, what's a person? Well, it's a human. But what is it in the system? It's the table where you put all their data. Okay, done. The next big problem we ran into were competing priorities for the different agencies. Now, if you look at an org chart for any government, If you go up high enough, basically the only person that it's in common is like the governor or the president, right? Because no one has any connection to each other. So this is like org chart on steroids. You have to go up and up and up before you have any kind of common agreement between everyone. And so this really caused us some issues when we're trying to figure out, who we should build this system for. Who are the most important people? What are the things we should focus on? And we went to each of these individual agencies in the state of Texas and said, what is the most important thing that you have to deal with on a daily basis? What is the thing that this system should really be geared around and focused on? The law enforcement officers said the offense and arrest. That's literally what they did all day long, is find people that were doing something bad and arrest them for it, and then fill out like hours of paperwork afterwards. So they were really just focused on someone doing something wrong and arresting them for it. I won't go into any other further details than that, but let's just say they just arrest them and everything's okay after that. The courts. The courts were all about the trial. The process of the legal process of a trial, the outcomes, the dispositions, and scheduling and all that sort of junk. That's what the courts were really focused on. The prosecutors were all about the cases. They were really, on a daily basis, concerned about taking the case to trial, building up evidence, building out whatever they have to do. It's been a while since I've seen Law and Order, so whatever they have to do to bring the case to trial, that's what they were focused on. And finally, the juvenile probation department, these were the ones that are really all about the kids. Like literally, on a daily basis, what they did every day was focus on the kids. Now, each of these are fine by themselves, but when you try to build a system that tries to satisfy all of these things, you're not going to really satisfy anyone. The people we wound up actually satisfying were the juvenile probation department, because they were the actual product owners in the system. All the other parts of the system, they're like, I don't know, like I guess you need to write down some arrest information, maybe, and then hit save, and you're done, right? That's all you need to do. So all the other parts of the system suffered as a result of having only really one party involved throughout the process. And no one could really agree about what the main point of the system was. To the point where they'd have shouting matches and just all sorts of crazy things inside those product owner meetings. Eventually, they just banned everyone that wasn't a probation officer because it was just too heated and contested to figure out how to make these different compromises. So that was our third lesson, that in addition to the language everyone using should make sense to everyone, we also want to make sure that the thing you're most focused on, the core purpose and the core domain in the system, really should have agreement across everyone using the system, that is the most important thing, and that's what we should be focusing on. Well, we didn't have that, so we had one main system and a bunch of other junk that was very kind of half-built. Question in the front there? Well, there's a whole part 2 to this, by the way, where we go into the new system we built. So we'll get into how we addressed all of these different problems in the second part here. Okay, so yes, of course you need a core domain. You need some language around your models that everyone agrees upon. So we finally got to something that everyone actually agreed upon, which was amazing. That's like the hardest thing to do. We found a word that everyone used. And this word was offense. Everyone knew what an offense was. And it was actually kind of tricky because an offense has both like a code, so like if you like a specific kind of offense that you've done, and also the incident of you doing that bad thing is also an offense, so it's very confusing for us. But everyone used this term, offense. So I said, okay, finally, like person didn't make any sense to anyone, so okay, we messed that one up. But offense, everyone uses this word, from the courts to the law enforcement officers to the probation, everyone uses this term. So then we went to everyone and said, okay, tell me what an offense is. Let's see if we can get some agreement there. Ha 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 ha. We did not. To the law enforcement officers, the offense was a form they filled out. Form CR-23J. That's literally the form that they fill out. In triplicate, of course, with carbon copy paper, right? You have to press down really hard to make sure. Do they still use carbon copy? Absolutely they do. There's plenty of still paper-based systems out there in the state of Texas. So yeah, form CR-23J was the form they filled out when someone got in trouble. And that's what they would submit to the Central Department of Public Safety for records keeping. They'd have one copy for the prosecution department, one copy for the courts, one copy for anyone that needed it. That's what an offense was for them. The courts, for them, an offense was just something to adjudicate. So someone got in trouble, that's fine, but there's all the other stuff around about what are the procedures around this kind of thing, offense versus the other kind of offense. Misdemeanors versus felonies is a very different process as well. Different, even courts. So in Texas as well, like if you get arrested for a DWI or DUI, there's actually separate courts in the state of Texas for that versus like some other, like stole a car or whatever. So they have a lot of different processes around those different offenses. So for them, it's really about not just the thing you did wrong, but all the process on the legal side of how they need to deal with that. Prosecution, surprise, surprise, offense is something to charge for. They need to charge you for the offense and get some kind of disposition on the other side. And that's really all they're about, is like something you did wrong, now we need to charge you for it and take it to trial. Following the probation department, offense was just really something to move past. Like, I know you did something wrong, but let's get you in the right path, and let's move past this bad thing that you did. So no one agreed, even on this term offense, no one agreed at all what this term really meant. What are the rules around it? What are the different validations and different processes we should put in place? Everyone had a very, very different view of this thing, that even though they had the same name of the thing, no one agreed about what that name actually meant or the rules and process that should be around it. So that was lesson number 4. Ubiquitous language needs to have consensus. Even when everyone uses the same word, if they don't have the same meaning for the word, then they're never going to agree about how the system should actually build and behave. So for a lot of things, there was a lot of compromises and a lot of really a lot of good parts of the system, but for the parts that people didn't agree upon, they just had a big comments field, and that's where the real process happened. Our final lesson, dealing with this, I haven't gotten into any of the code, but this last lesson was really around the code. So in a normal kind of interior system, I've got a UI layer, a business logic layer, the data access layer, and the database. This is the interior architecture that you can still, I think, find on MSDN from Microsoft about how to build these systems. Well, we were going to build this completely different and much better. So we have domain objects instead of the business logic layer, and a repository instead of the data access layer, right? Much, much better. Now, has anyone here been in a meeting where they discussed the different kinds of repository patterns and which one's better and how exactly they should build the repositories? Yes, what a waste of time, right? So this is what we did. We argued endlessly about what are the different repository patterns, what are the different entity patterns, the aggregate patterns, value object patterns, what are the right ways to build all of these. You probably read some of my blog posts on the subject as well, and I'm sorry about that. And so, of course, this is no one really agreed about what these things were, because the original DDD book didn't go into a lot of detail about the code behind these different pieces. They just said, repository is this thing, and you should use it, and that's about it. But there's no real examples. But there started to become more and more examples coming out of the community. So we just took those patterns and implemented all of them to see which one fit. So this is an example of one of our repositories. And I can't blame anyone but myself for building this, because I wrote it, so it's my fault. This is the offense repository, offense being one of the really important things. So there are 2 kinds of repository patterns I see out there. One is the generic repository, so that's I repository of T. So you have just a kind of generic repository, and you fill in the details of, like, I'm a repository of a product, repository of order, repository of whatever. And so we had that. There's also the specific repository. So instead of you having just a generic one that can do everything, you build very specific repositories for individual entities. So in that case, you'd have like a I product repository, I order repository. In this case, we have I offense repository. And so we did both. We did both the specific and the generic repositories, because why not? Now, in this repository, of course, it's supposed to be like the data access gateway to the database, because you don't want to depend directly on your ORM in your code, right? That's a very bad thing to do. And so you had to hide and abstract away the ORM behind this. And so every single kind of query in our system that we would have have to add another method on a repository to represent that individual request or individual thing we were trying to get out of the database. So we had some simple ones like find by ID, but you had more specific ones like, let's see, what do I have here? Get chronic offender offenses, get by prosecutor caseload criteria, get offenses submitted for approval with agency, get offenses involving weapon where juvenile is offender, get offensive involving weapons where juvenile is complainant. So very different things there. And so every single individual query we'd have to put it in here. And this, of course, this class got ridiculously big, right? It was like thousands of lines with all these different queries. And in fact, I even had to cut it off. You don't see the curly brace because the curly brace is somewhere like 10 feet below the sub base here. Because it was just everything in the system had to do with offenses. And if we wanted the system to perform, we would have to tailor each query for each request, and then, of course, shove it onto this one single interface. So Eric Evans, about 10 years after he wrote the DDD book, he put out a presentation was what he would do differently with the book, looking back 10 years later. And one of the big things he talks about was people focused a lot on the structural patterns, the entities, aggregates, repositories, and we certainly did. So people focused a lot on those things, but those are actually the least important parts of the book. And if he had to do it over again, he would take all those pages talking about repositories and aggregates and entities, he would take those out of the book, put them at the end, maybe as appendix, and maybe just take them out altogether. Because those were the least important parts. And that's what we got, for our final lesson. We argued endlessly about the different patterns inside domain-driven design, but those were the least important part of DDD. Those are the least contributing factors to the success of the overall project. And also, my side note there is that layers are for cakes, not for systems. So we also had a just insanely convoluted, we called it the onion architecture, and it made us cry. So would suggest not doing that either. And so we built this ridiculously layered architecture with all these different layers of indirection and abstraction, thinking that we were giving this like really pure model at the end. And we wound up with was these repositories with 100 methods on them. Not a very good end state. So, final tally for this system. We had 195 controllers, 652 actions, 121 roles in the system. So I said there were 72, but actually ballooned to 121 different roles in the system. 218 entities, 184 value objects, 352 enumerations, and a partridge in a pear tree. Now, when we built this, we were actually really proud of how big it was. That's not really something you should be proud of, by the way. It's like, look how much stuff there is. Wow, that's a lot of stuff. We even had Microsoft come out to us, and we were showing them how we did our MVC application. Like, yeah, it's so big, and so here's all these things we put in there to just manage with how big it was. And then it was like, ooh, wow, that is big. It's a big application. But I will say that we had, as of the last, last time I checked earlier this year, we had 50 counties deployed. So even though we had all these different contentions and compromises, we still shipped. And for me, that was the most important thing, was that this product actually shipped and is still being developed today. So going back to our majestic monolith, this is the picture that we were drawn, or we were shown from the DHH article about, look how lovely this big system can be. Everything's like steel glass towers. We've got like, I guess there's a monorail there for, because the future has monorail, right? We have like all this green and stuff like that. But the reality was more like District 9. Where everything's put together by duct tape and baling wire and just a bunch of compromises. And somehow it all functions, but no one knows how. It's just like it works, but no one really knows how it's still continuing to operate. So we did that project, had a lot of lessons learned, and really just put it out of my mind. But about a year and a half, 2 years after we finished the previous project, which was in development for about 2.5 years or so, we get a call from the same client that said, okay, right, we have got a new project for you. Remember that juvenile project that we had before? Well, now we're going to do the adult project. So the part 2 is the do-over. Now, originally, the do-over was not a do-over. Originally, the do-over was going to be a carbon copy of what we did the first time. So there was a juvenile case management system. Anyone want to guess about what the new system was going to be? Adult case management system, right? ACMS, of course. So we were going to build the adult case management system. We actually lost the original bid. They gave it out to someone else. 18 months later, that other project failed, and they called us back and said, oops, that other project failed. We need you to do it. We need you to do it over. But we don't have the budget anymore for you to replace the entire system. We're just going to have you focus on this one individual piece, which was great actually, because I don't have many clients that have the budget or the time to replace an entire system at once. They usually don't have that ability. They usually say, well, we want to replace everything, but we only have enough budget for this one piece, so let's just do that. So it turns out that although we didn't intend to build like a smaller microservice-oriented architecture for this piece, it was just a side effect of they already spent all the money, and this is all the money I have left. So that was a do-over. So a little bit of project background here. It was, again, too expensive, risky, or costly to build that one single system. They already tried that, and it didn't work. So instead, what they're going to do is focus on one individual agency at a time. Looking at, this agency has some budget, so we'll go take their budget and pull it together to build that one system for that one piece there. And we're going to start with the prosecution department. So looking at this original picture of all the different flows here, again, like color coding, that should have been a clue, right? Like if the state of Texas can't just like make one system for everybody, even in like the legal process, maybe it was a clue for us, like maybe we shouldn't do that. We shouldn't try that either. So we were going to focus on that one blue part in the middle there. It still looks pretty big, and it was big. Like there's a lot of complexity inside that one box. But we weren't going to try to satisfy everyone across the entire state of Texas. We're really just going to do that one single system for just the prosecution agencies. And it turns out when you see these places that go from one color to the next, they have very well-defined handoffs and transactions between these different pieces that are literally written to the state code of Texas about when a law enforcement officer gives the list of offenses to the prosecution department, it needs to look like this. They need to do it within this certain amount of time. It has to have this certain information on there. It has to go through this certain process. So that was already there for us. We just needed to actually do it. So this new system, we were going to build it around bounded context. That chapter we all skipped in the DDD book, we're going to go back and read it, and then read it again because it's so dry. It's like reading, I don't know, reading some horribly verbose guy. So we went back and said, okay, we're going to build this one system just for this one department, and things inside of there will be very specific to the prosecution agency. But outside of that bounded context, we won't expose those kind of details. So the prosecution department, what do they deal with every day? Cases. So that was like the main focus of that system, was to focus on the cases. They also have dockets, which I didn't know what that was before I did this project, but dockets are a thing. Grand jury is a very special process, and we also have to have some kind of thing to piece everything together. So we had workflow. So around this, we're going to build a wall and make them pay for it, right? And build. Someone's paying for it. I don't know. The math is funny here. And anyone that wanted to deal with the information inside of the system would have to go through very special interactions. So the law enforcement agency, they do have to deal with the prosecution department, and so they would be outside of the system through a very special window into the system. Defense attorneys as well, they have to deal with the case information there, and courts and indigent defense as well. So we said, okay, yes, there's other people. We're not going to try to make one system for everyone, and we'll have these very well-defined boundaries, and we think we're on the good path. Now, one thing that we do very often with our projects is at the very beginning of the project, we like to go physically out to where the people that are doing the work and see what are they actually doing on a daily basis. So we drove out to counties in the state of Texas to see how does the prosecution department actually work here. And at the time, we were really excited because I don't get to talk a lot to the people that use the systems I build. It's can be kind of sad sometimes. Like you built this awesome thing, but you don't actually get to talk to like who actually uses it. So this is exciting. Like we built this juvenile case system. Now I get to go out and talk to the people that actually use it on a daily basis. So yeah, I can't wait to get all the compliments and accolades from this awesome system we built. Reality was a little bit different. We came in and said, hey, yeah, remember us? We're the people that built the juvenile case management system. The literal quote. Yeah, which is not something you generally don't want to hear this about the system that you built, that you're very proud of. And lots of open source projects and lots of blog entries around this, and the people that actually use it are like, oh, that piece of junk? Like, oh, oops. But the reality was, well, yeah, it's so good. We have the best controllers. So, why did he hate the system? Well, because the system wasn't built for him. It wasn't built for any of the people in his department. It was built for the probation officers. And the probation officers and the prosecution department have very, very different goals and different functions that they perform. And almost they're at complete odds with each other. The prosecution department is all about taking a case to trial and getting some kind of disposition or outcome of it. Where the probation department is like, let's just forget about it. Let's don't worry about it. Let's just get the kid out of trouble and get him to a good place where they can meaningfully contribute to society. And you look at them like, oh God, those mean prosecutors. They're just there trying cases. But when you talk to them, the stories they have are, some of them are horrible stories of the things that they've seen, the cases they've tried. We also have to be very careful about the test data we put in there. We do things like Bart Simpson murdered Maggie system and Lisa, and then murdered his parents too. Ha ha, Homer's dead as well. And we of course we had Seinfeld characters in there as well. But when you put that kind of test data in there, the prosecutors would remember a case that was literally that situation. Be like, oh man, that's like the 1984 yogurt murders or something. Like, oh. So just like side note, be careful with your test data. Make sure it doesn't offend anyone with what you do. So in the previous system, it was all about the kids. The prosecution department, when we went to ask them and said, what is the most important thing that you do on a daily basis? It's the case. So in the new system, instead of building it around the individual that's in trouble, we built around what matters to the prosecution department, which was around cases. So in this case, in this example, the first thing they would see is a case, not a person, because you can try multiple people together inside a single case. So for them, it was all about that one case. And it looks kind of ugly, but this is like the best our designer could do to have everyone agree about what it should look like. So lots of tans there. That's just what we had to do. Anyway, so this one I have looks like I got in trouble for burglary of a rail car. That was the one offense that no one had any negative reaction to, which is a felony in Texas. So don't steal a rail car. That's serious business here. So yeah, they would when they logged in and saw their cases, that was the most important thing, the front and center thing they would have to deal with. And so we were able to build a system around what they needed, as opposed to this awful compromise that really didn't satisfy anyone. We were also able to get a lot of more meaningful interactions with the system as well. In the previous juvenile system, if you looked at the actual cases, which is funny because it's juvenile case management system, but it was really about the juveniles. If you looked at the case parts of the system, they were all just very dumb crud screens. Like edit case, create case, can't delete cases, but you can close cases. And that was about it. Well, close was actually just edit with a checkbox to say close. So that was that. But this new system, we were able to build much more meaningful interactions. And so what we found was, with this new system, when we focused on a single domain, we could really dig deep into that domain and build a very meaningful interactive system for those users that actually helped them on their job and didn't have these comment fields which were the actual business processes. We were able to actually build the business processes into the system by focusing on the core domain. So that was our first lesson with the new system, that when you have a very cohesive system, it brings you a second level of insights into the domain that lets you build that even better system for the customers. Now, I think in the book, the domain-driven design book, Eric Evans even calls this out. There's breakthroughs you can have. We had those similar kind of things. When we came in to the system, we assumed that the most important thing would be the defendant because they're trying the case. But after about a month, there's a lot of back and forth. Finally, we said, actually, I think case is the most important thing. And whenever your product owner says, of course that's the most important thing. How did you not know that earlier? That's when you know you've actually hit the right mark there. Now, in the previous system as well, one of the big mistakes we made were around the security and the way we modeled the roles and access and authorization in the system. In the previous system, all of the roles were hard-coded into the system. So Larry, the law enforcement officer, that was actually a role in the system. And we had a very set of well-defined permissions that role could have. And with those 121 different roles in the system, they'd have to have counties set up their users for all those different roles, which makes a lot of sense if you're like Dallas and you have 1,000 people or 2,000 people that all touch the system. But for Podunk, West Texas, where the judge is also the law enforcement officer, is also the prosecution agency. But probably shouldn't be all those things, but that's just how it works out there. they don't need that complexity of the model. So in the new system, we threw out whatever we were doing before and modeled it much more granular here. So in this new system, we had users. So yeah, still had a user, but user was no longer tied to a person or defendant. So you can't be a user also tied to like a court record. Those would be two different records altogether. Those would have, a user could have multiple roles, and those are dynamic. So each individual county could define those. And the things that were hard-coded in the system were at the very bottom right-hand corner here, the actual permissions. The permissions we would enforce, those were set by the system. We had this one big file that had all the different all the different possible permissions, and we make these very granular to the activities that you could perform. So we would have things like being able to view private cases. That was the very first one, I guess, that we have up there. Being able to do CRUD activities like viewing aliases, adding or editing them. But we also have more granular things like being able to assign a case to someone. That was an individual permission. So instead of having a generic edit case, we'd have a button on the screen that said assign case. And there would be a permission associated with being able to do that. And if your role had this permission, then you could do that activity. But if you didn't have that permission, that button wouldn't even show up for you. By having some things hard-coded and some things not hard-coded, we're able to really rally around these different concepts. So even the controller actions in our system, we had the individual permissions on each of those controller actions. So if I wanted to see, should I show this link or this button or not, I can just go look up to see what permission is associated with that action. And if they don't have the permission, I don't even show it on the screen. So I'm not allowing the user to get into situations they can't get into. So that was our second lesson here, that it is important for us to be flexible in some places where it needs to be flexible, but rigid in others. Some of the off-the-shelf products that we saw were these like infinitely configurable systems where you can add new attributes to things, you can add new tables to things, and you can have all this crazy configuration, but the system then at that point didn't have any intelligence that was actually inside of it. So for us, by having some things hard-coded where it needed to be and some things not, we're able to build a lot of behaviors and actions around the places that were hard-coded, and the things that didn't need to be hard-coded, we could just make them flexible. Now, one of the things that we did was to go to all the counties to see how the prosecution departments worked. After we got past the initial insults of the original project, we were able to dig down deep to see, okay, what are the major things that you deal with on a daily basis? What problems should this system solve? Some counties had almost no problems. They're like, this existing system is fine, but it's COBOL, so we need to replace it because that's what you have to do with COBOL systems, right? You have to replace them. And so others, what we found is interesting is that we went to Fort Worth County and Dallas County, and they both told us they had the exact same major problem, the file management problem. Now, for Dallas County had a lot of money in their IT department. So their systems were much more advanced than the other systems we saw in the state of Texas. And one of the things that they have in their previous system was the ability to take all of the kind of digital evidence that could exist out there for someone committing a crime and store it locally on their servers. So if you robbed a bank, for example, they would take the CCTV footage, take that tape, digitize it, and store it on their internal servers. That does have an issue, though, because any evidence you pull in, you have to keep for a certain amount of years, and that's set by the law. I think in Texas it's like 25 years or 30 years, a very long time. And so all this footage, you have to have the raw footage. So for them, they just didn't know what to do with all this data that they couldn't delete or get rid of. They had to keep for this very long amount of time. So for them, the file management problem was like these really huge files they had to keep for a very long amount of time. And we had to solve this problem of, well, how do we deal with this number only growing over time and this only more and more digital media evidence? As long as it hasn't been accidentally deleted by anyone, then we have to keep that digital evidence almost forever. So we went over, took the hour or so drive over to Fort Worth County and said, okay, what is the major problem you deal with? File management. Like, oh, that's funny. We just heard that from your friends over there. They're not friends, by the way. They hate each other, Dallas and Fort Worth. But they have the exact same problem and said, yes, we have this really big file management problem. I said, okay, great. Can you show me? We walked over and they pointed up here. A leak in the ceiling was dripping water on their physical paper files, ruining them. Like that's a very different kind of file management problem. Like literally you have physical like paper files that you have to manage on a daily basis. Actually, when we walked through the office, we couldn't even walk side by side. We had to walk like this because all the hallways were filled with boxes up to the ceiling of all the files. Now you may ask, why would they put that in their office as opposed to something like a basement? Well, basements can flood sometimes. And so that's actually what happened before, that like a decade earlier, their basement had flooded after some heavy rain, ruined all of their files, and they literally had to drop cases because that was the only record that file existed. Or the only record that case actually existed. We had some visits where we come in, everyone's just like working normally. Then some days, like everyone's just like going around like crazy, going looking through all these boxes and files. We're like, what the hell is going on here? And someone lost a file. Someone lost a case. I was like, well, that's not too bad, right? Everyone loses cases. Like, no, they physically lost the case. They can't find it. So when that happens, like everything in the entire office stopped while they tried to figure out where the heck this case was. Like, oh, did Bob take it home? Did he put it in his briefcase and take it home? Did we give it to Mary to make copies? Did we ever get it back? So that like they were just paranoid about losing these cases because if they lost the case, they literally lost the case. You don't have the case, like you can't bring it to trial. Like you just show up like, I don't know what we're here for or why, but let's just get started, right? It doesn't really happen that way. So this presented a big challenge for us because even though everyone was a prosecution department, they had very different problems they were dealing with. And even if we just modernized everyone, it didn't mean that everyone wanted to use this system in the exact same way. So we needed to build a system that, in addition to just dealing with cases, could deal with the flexible or the differing kind of workflows and business processes of these very two different kind of places. In the original juvenile system, we set a workflow for everyone in the state of Texas. And one person liked it, and about 50,000 people didn't. But in this case, we said, let's not build and hard code the business process of how you want to work cases, because it turns out there's no real guidance from the state of Texas and the law about how you actually organize and manage the caseload on a daily basis. They have very well-defined legal processes, but in terms of like, okay, when someone comes in with a case, what do we do with it? Do we first make copies of it? Do we go give it to this person? Do we have to notify? So like, none of that was built into the law, and so everyone just had their own internal processes. So what we want to do is build some kind of flexible system that allowed each individual county to define their own individual workflows. Now, when you go to someone, go to a product owner and said, okay, looks like we need some workflows. Like something lights up, like this is their time to shine. Like now, ooh, workflow, huh? Well, now we can build the most complicated thing ever because what does every product owner use on a daily basis? No, that's architects. Jira. And beware the product owner that loves Jira because they want your system to just be Jira, right? Just do that. Like make the search, they can just search everything and come back with results. Just do that. This visible workflow that you can tie things together with different states, let's just do that. Like Atlassian's a very big company. We can just build that. So we want to start out very simple and very small, and that's what we did. It was a very difficult discipline process we had to do to say, let's not build the most complicated workflow system imaginable. Let's just start with the very simplest thing that could possibly work. And so that's what we started out with. We had a very simple state machine. We had individual statuses, and those statuses could be tied to some sort of entity, and it would have some kind of name describing what that state was. So this is what we started out with, just a status with a name, and that's it. But you can't just have a status by itself. You have to have some kind of ability to tie individual states to other states. And so we'd have transitions that tied this state and what you can do after this. This state, you might have multiple next steps, multiple different options. So you could decide to try a case, or you could decide to dismiss a case based on where its current status is. So we had these transitions that define what the current state was, as well as what the possible next state was. And we'd have a name for that transition as well. So like assign a case, that is a transition from unassigned to assigned. And so that was the name of that transition we put there. A little bit later on, we saw that not everyone can do every kind of action, every kind of transition, so we started to add security on top of it. So only certain roles could perform certain transitions. And finally, this is the battle we lost. Some transitions need to have custom screens associated with them to say like, well, when you assign a case, you need to fill out this information. But this other county doesn't even assign cases. They just all go to this one person. So they don't even need a assigned case at all. It just gets automatically assigned. So I said, okay, well, for some actions, maybe we'll have a very specific screen. So we made these workflow transition actions to be able to have individual controllers and actions being executed whenever I hit that one single transition. So with this sort of simplified workflow model, we were able to define workflows and business processes for all the different counties. They didn't have to actually have all the same different ones. We could go to an individual county, walk through how their process was, and come back and design the workflow that they needed, as opposed to what some other county, which would be totally different kind of workflow, what they needed. And in fact, they would have some of the counties that actually reorganize their desks in order for the workflow to work a little bit better. It's pretty neat. The previous system was also driven 100% based on searching. So you would have to know the person or the case number to go actually load up the case. For this new one, though, we drive all of their work by those individual statuses. So these menu options are actually screens that show all of the cases in that one individual status. So all of the work being done, instead of before being driven by just like everyone remembering and searching and having comment fields, instead we drive the work all via queues. Each of these queues would be a list of cases that it needed to work with. And so it's very much a like lean, theory of constraints, the goal kind of activity of looking at what their workflow was, figuring out how to move something from one point to the next. So that was our third lesson here, is that sometimes our model is not the thing we're just focused on, like the case. Sometimes it's a step up from what that model is. So for them, like they would have never thought to model workflow. They would have just continued to use that comment field. But by digging deeper into seeing what their actual business problems were, we were able to look at a model that was actually above all their existing models. Now for the technical parts, where we got rid of all the layers. One of the things I did with this new project is I'm not going to put any pattern in place until it's actually needed. So we wound up just doing like the most simplest thing that could possibly work. And we waited about 2 months before we took a step back and said, what are the actual patterns that are emerging here? What are the things we're actually seeing on a daily basis? So the first thing we did was collapse all that insane layered architecture into just like a project with just the files and stuff in there, using folders for organization. What? Folders? As opposed to all these different like layered architecture projects. And we looked at, okay, now that I have a bigger view of this, what is actually going on in the system? This is a web application that just did gets and posts. Everything in the system could be boiled down to I am getting some information or I'm changing some information. So instead of building our system around those individual layers, we saw that really, in reality, our system was only made up of asking information from the system via a query or changing the system via some kind of command. So we wound up modeling everything in our system in this kind of request-response manner. I have request to do something, or I have request for information, and everything goes through that kind of pattern. So everything had some kind of input that would go through some kind of request handler and have some kind of output. Whether it was a query or command, I would have this kind of process in place. We wound up I wound up making an open source project called Mediator out of this. I don't know how to pronounce it, by the way. I just typed it. I didn't know how to pronounce it. So it's Mediator or Mediator. I don't care. And put this in the middle of the thing that managed getting the request into the actual thing that would handle the response. Which meant our controllers suddenly got very, very thin. Each individual action really just delegated the real work, the business logic, to a handler through this one individual mediator pattern. And that mediator would mediate the request going to the handler and then getting the response back out. And then the controllers were really just kind of a traffic cop of request coming in. Okay, if there's some UI stuff, I'll do some UI stuff, but mainly hand it off to this other thing that's doing the actual work. That meant that we were able to get rid of all those abstractions in our application. So this is actually a real code from our system. Now you notice that there's no services, there's no like service layer, there's no repositories either. We're just using everything directly. And we internally said, we're just going to use everything directly until it becomes a problem, and then we'll put those patterns in place, but until those patterns become a problem, we won't. And so years later, we still didn't need those patterns, and so that's why we're just using all those third-party dependencies directly here. Once we started having these requests and these handlers and these DTOs, it got really weird organizing them by kind because we'd have to be going all over the application. So one of the big things we did was organize our application by feature as opposed to by type or kind. So inside one of these folders for the features, I would have everything that had to do with that feature. So all of the handlers, the validation, the JavaScript, the view, those were all right next to each other on the hard drive, so that when I was building a feature, everything that I needed was right next to each other. I didn't have to go hunt around for everything I needed. It was just, boom, right there, everything that I needed. So that was our fourth lesson. Don't blindly follow pattern advice, with a caveat of CQRS is lovely. So that is something to take a look at. All right, the very last lesson was how we were going to deal with a system that now had to talk to other systems. When in the previous juvenile system, it was just one single application, so I didn't have to coordinate with anything. But now this new system, I actually had to deal with others. So we had our bounded context in the wall that we had built around here, and we needed to now deal with these other external parties. So the law enforcement agency, they had to deal with us. So we went to them and said, what thing do you need versus everyone else? What can we build just for you? And so we wound up building for them was a portal application. A very thin application that only they used, that only accomplished the tasks that they needed to do in order to be able to interact with the rest of the prosecution department. So just a completely separate application, tiny little window, and they didn't have to become users in the rest of the entire system. Defense attorney was a little bit different. Defense attorneys have their own very separate rules and regulations, and a lot of times the defense attorneys were dealing with other prosecution agencies as well. So we didn't want to have every single defense attorney have to have a login for every system. So for them, we wound up building an external portal. And this external portal communicated via REST APIs, like actual fielding REST, dissertation style, hypermedia, and all that junk, to the defense attorney API that was built just for them. We really pushed back on trying to build any kind of general purpose APIs just in case someone needed it. We built something very, very specific and targeted just for the defense attorney needs based on their goals and what they needed to do, and didn't try to solve everyone's problem. We did similar things for the indigent defense, which are, if you can't pay for an attorney, you get one of those. And the court system as well. They had very, very different systems with very specific interactions, very specific integrations based on the needs for those individual systems. So that was our final lesson. Microservices and anti-corruption layers are your friend. When you're dealing with having to build multiple systems, then you have to start looking at integration patterns and how to have those systems communicate. But those are a lot of solved problems, and so you just takes a bit of research and learning to figure out what are the right ways to piece all these different systems together. So, final tally. We had 70 controllers, so much fewer than the 200. It was still a lot, but I mean, it's manageable. And this was across all the different applications, the portals, the APIs, everything. 70 controllers, 600 actions. It turns out that's very similar to the previous one, but because we're able to focus on a single domain, we could have much more granular, tailored actions for what the users can do. A lot of permissions, a lot of entities, zero value objects. We got rid of those because those aren't a thing in SQL, so we didn't make them a thing for us. 80 enumerations, and at the last time I checked, it was about 30 counties deployed across the state of Texas. So, if I was to go look at the good parts of DDD, everyone's seen this picture, right? Like, there's JavaScript, the definitive guide, and the good parts, and you're like, it's only that much. It's even smaller now because I think they got rid of all the semicolons in the new edition. But I've looked at the domain-driven design book and did the same thing. What if I took all the good parts out of it and made a single condensed version of what that was? It turns out that's actually the Building Microservices book. So if you want to learn how to build good domain-driven design applications, I would actually start with the book on the right, and if you want, then you can go back to the book on the left. So that was Domain-Driven Design, The Good Parts. I'm Jimmy Bogard. I hope you have a great rest of the conference. Thank you.